Welcome back to Redefining AI. Now, today I'm speaking with someone who has fundamentally reshaped how leaders understand platforms, digital ecosystems, and now how AI is rewriting the architecture of the knowledge economy. Now, Sangeet Paul Choudary is the best-selling co-author of Platform Revolution and the author of Reshuffle, the book that's just won the 2025 Thinkers50 Strategy Award for the most impactful idea in strategy. Now, his work has guided CEOs across more than 40 Fortune 500 companies. He's advised pre-IPO tech firms and he serves as a senior fellow at UC Berkeley, all whilst featuring at global stages from the G20 Summit to the World Economic Forum. Reshuffle, his book, frames AI not as a smarter brain, but as the missing glue that finally allows complex systems to work together. Through sharp analysis and vivid examples from shipping containers to pit lanes in Formula One, Sangeet shows that the most transformative technologies don't simply automate, they reorganize entire systems of power coordination and value creation. Now, in this episode, we're unpacking who wins and who gets left behind when AI restacks the deck. So welcome to Redefining AI, Sangeet. It's really wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Lauren. Pleasure to be here as well.
So Reshuffle is your latest book, and in Reshuffle, you challenge the dominant narrative about AI. And I can hear many listeners thinking, the dominant narrative? What's dominant narrative? There's so many narratives. We're talking about conversation. There's so many conversations about AI. Redefining AI, we don't like to touch on too many of the cliched ones. I know that the cliched ones are of importance, but how would you yourself articulate the narrative in its simplest form? And what's at stake? This is, I think, the more interesting component. What's at stake if leaders really keep believing this sort of dominant narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are three elements to the dominant narrative that I also talk about in the book. The first part of it, which most of the listeners will easily relate with, is that we think of AI primarily in terms of intelligence. So we talk about the impact of AI in terms of the benchmark that's hitting. GPT 5.2 launched today. And again, it's talking about the benchmark, which kinds of exams it's able to pass. So we're always framing AI in terms of intelligence, and we haven't really framed any technology before that in exactly those terms alone. So while intelligence is important, it's also important to understand that the impact of a technology comes not through the performance of a technology, but through how the larger systems around it are restructured, how our organizations, our workflows, our ways of working and thinking, how our human systems, all of that get restructured. So the first thing that I, just essentially want to talk about is don't overemphasize intelligence, because the impact of AI will not come through brute force improvements in intelligence. The second dominant narrative that I see is this idea that AI will lead to one of two extreme scenarios. It's either going to be all boom and, prosperity, or it's going to be doom and gloom. And I don't think that's really true. And it's not also a positive sum versus a zero sum way of thinking about it. I think what's going to happen, and I believe this is what has happened with every technological shift before as well, is that the pie will grow. So there will be a boom in the overall pie, but how it gets sliced is not necessarily going to be very equal. In fact, in recent times, we've seen more and more inequality in how the pie gets sliced, who gets which part of the new gains that get uncovered. So it's important to understand that there will be winners and losers, not because you are moving things away as they are today, but because a new system is emerging, and the way that system will get distributed or value will get distributed will be fundamentally different. And I can take many examples from the last 15 years that illustrate this as well. The third narrative I just want to talk about, which the book talks about quite a bit, is we think about AI's impact on work as AI changing certain tasks. It either replaces human effort at the task or it improves human effort at the task. So we have a note taker on this call right now that's replacing human effort. Somebody would have had to listen in and take notes, or it can improve human effort in certain other ways. My point is that the impact of AI plays out not just at the level of tasks, but it plays out at the level of changing our assumptions on which we structure what an industry is doing, what an organization is doing, what a workflow is supposed to do, what a team is supposed to do. All of these are structured on certain assumptions of a previous world where knowledge or access to knowledge work was scarce. Now, suddenly access to certain forms of knowledge work is no longer scarce. So those assumptions have to go away. And with that, whichever systems were structured on those assumptions, they have to be restructured as well. So to think of AI, you can't just focus on which task it's changing, but you think about the assumptions.
So there's a lot of things that have to change, and also it's the question of how quick they have to change, essentially, with implementation. So one thing that I want to focus on is why then do you think at the moment that there is this dominant and still dominant and constant narrative around the productivity element of AI? As you've mentioned, the third point, the replacement of effort, the improvement of effort, and not about the systematical shift that is necessary. If you look at the implementation and the workflow amendment, why is it related to the component of understanding intelligent? Is it because there's only few that are able to regard it as what you've forefronted as point 1 and 2? Like, why is that, in your opinion?
Yeah, there are a couple of different factors to it. One is certainly the unique environment we are in right now, where capital is abundant, but attention is scarce, and narrative helps to kind of channel capital towards yourself if you are able to grab that attention. So part of it is about, how do we capture the narrative in a way that we can attract more and more capital. But the second aspect of it is that we tend to overemphasize efficiency gains, productivity gains, cost savings with every technological shift. Even if you see the shift to the cloud, initially the overemphasis was on total cost of ownership of IT infrastructure. But if you really look back at what the cloud did, it was not just modernization of IT infrastructure. It fundamentally changed the way companies were structured, the way organizations were structured, the way industries competed. I'll give a few examples. The cloud allowed open APIs, and that allowed hyper specialization of companies who could take one capability and specialize on just that. That in turn changed how companies were competing, because in the past they were competing by doing things end-to-end vertical integration. Now that many of those capabilities were taken away from them, they were suddenly left sort of uncovered. They didn't have a single way in which they could compete on the remaining capabilities. So the nature of competition changed. When you could open your capability as APIs, they could be used in other industries. So industry boundaries became, more porous. And really the way, if you think of the distinction between a company like Adobe, which was structured in a pre-cloud world, versus a company like Figma, which is structured around the cloud, Adobe is very much focused on design execution. Figma is focused on serving design into workflows and enabling collaboration around that. So the nature of work as well changed. So we've seen all of these shifts happen before, but even then, the dominant narrative started with total cost of ownership of IT infrastructure. And I think that's where we typically, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And that's where we are at this point. We're still talking about the dominant narrative as something you can easily show on a spreadsheet, whereas the actual effect, I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, will increasingly show up not on spreadsheets, but in the new systems that come up.
So I think that this is really important if we take it from an angle of, and I'm going to stick with the Figma example that you've highlighted. Now, there's been a lot of conversation around the future development and the integration of AI companies and leaders that are leading AI companies. And one positioning is that a lot of people feel that it will be experts that win in this development and evolution and emergence of new products and companies because of the expertise that they have to be able to integrate AI into workflows. Would you agree with, what's your thoughts around that? Do you think then that it needs expertise from a product placement perspective to be able to succeed in realizing this systematic workflow necessity?
I think there are two things that are important. One is that outside in, you have to reimagine what the future landscape is going to look like. It's Adobe saying, I'm going to the cloud and using it as a channel, versus Figma saying that with the cloud, we can now enable all the workflows into which design is an input. So you have to reimagine, with this technology coming in, what is the new landscape going to look like? And in that, what is your new identity? You are no longer design software, you are design workflow collaboration software. And so you have to have a very clear view of what the landscape is going to be and what your role is going to be. Inside out, what is important, I'll break that down into two parts. The first part that's important is there has to be a clear way to identify to what extent technology is not yet achieving the returns that should be achieved. So there has to be a clear way to benchmark that versus just look at here's how expensive the previous task used to be, and here's how much we can save on the expense or increase the throughput. The better way to think about it is to think about technology investments and the return on technology investments more of, given the technology that we have available, and given how returns have been limited because of our previous constraints, now that those constraints go away, what can the new returns look like? So you have to do a bit of that to really identify what's that delta that you're missing today. And secondly, you talked about expertise in integrating AI into workflows. I think that again starts with assuming that the workflow should exist. You should start by asking, should that workflow even exist, or should it be eliminated completely, right? So a classic example of this is when recommendation systems improved with machine learning, companies like Instagram used that to just improve recommendations on the social graph, while TikTok came in and tried to reimagine how can you create a social network without a social graph, because the machine learning capabilities have improved so much. So what does the nature of the video need to change? How does the nature of interaction with the video need to change so that you have the right level of data coming in, so that eventually you don't even need the user to follow and build a network. You can just start serving the right video instantly. So that's really what's important. If we start with the workflow, if we start with today's assumptions, we'll just be stuck in the optimization loop again.
And it relates to, it's not a conscious thing, but there used to be a language examiner. I'm very focused on language. In our conversation, you have used Reimagine, your book's called Reshuffle.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we were to freeze frame to 2025, where would you say that we are now in this reshuffle cycle? Are we at the moment of tension? Are we at the moment of transition? Are we at the moment of transformation? And I think it relates to also your point of, should that workflow exist or should it not? Like, where are we?
I think we are, where cloud was in 2012. So it was 3 to 4 years in terms of adoption in the enterprise, but it had not fundamentally changed how the enterprise works. It was still an IT discussion. Mm-hmm. And today, I think that's where the AI discussion is. And we have to go through the difference over here is that there's a lot more hype than there ever was with cloud. There was no hype with cloud to the extent that it is today. It was a localized backend discussion.
That sexy.
Exactly. Yes, it was a back office localized discussion. This is completely different. Started on the consumer side. And then, AI in a way brings together both the transformation of the cloud and the excitement of mobile that happened around that time into one technology now. But I think going back to your question, the real thing is that we're at this point where the audience or the leaders who are applying AI are so confused because the narratives are so wildly towards productivity gains only. And that automatically splits the camp internally into AI blind believers and AI blind rejectors. Independent, there's no nuance left because the people have taken two extreme stances. So I think over the next 3-4 years, that whole thing is going to change. I believe we need to have some form of a correction, not just in the narrative, but in the valuations to force that correction in the narrative. And with that, all of the investments that have been made so far, both with the AI companies, but with the companies adopting that AI, they will just be forced to reimagine around the investments that they have made on how they can best leverage this towards maximum return. So I believe we are entering that reimagining phase right now, and we'll see that happen over the next 7 to 10 years.
And I mean, I didn't really want this to turn into a prediction conversation, but we're speaking about the necessary amendments that need to happen both from a narrative and also on the markets. And what needs to happen around the capital conversation and movement. Let's look at a more interesting angle. 26 is approaching. What do you foresee not happening that you would like to happen in 26?
I would like the market correction to happen as soon as possible and the narrative correction to happen as soon as possible. I don't think it'll happen as soon as we want it to happen. I think there are early signs of it happening in certain aspects, but we are probably 18 months away from that narrative correction to start happening in the organizations that are actually applying AI. But the narrative has already shifted a lot from where it was 12 months back, which was very, very different. It was very focused on GPT, I think 4, GPT-5 was going to come. And so it was very focused on just that intelligence narrative. And now there's a lot more focus on, well, what are we doing with all these AI investments? So I'd like to see that happen a lot sooner. I don't know whether it'll happen in 2026. That's how I think of it.
Okay. I mean, if we stick with, there's the argument as well that the AI native firms, that they're not necessarily defined by tools, but by their architecture, going back to the whole conversation that we're having at the moment. But what's the simplest tell that a company is genuinely AI native versus like just adopting AI?
Yeah, I think if a company is genuinely AI native, I would say there should be a very clear, distinct category that it can communicate to the market. It should not have to say, oh, we are the agentic enterprise for industry X. If you can describe what your new identity is without falling back on terms like agentic and intelligence, and underpinning that is AI, but you can describe what is the new way to play in this industry. Unless you're AI native, you can't really do that. That's one piece. If you're just putting on a tool, you are always going to say we are the agentic, manufacturer of industry X, etc. The second piece I would say is that AI's impact has to show in terms of how work is organized inside your company. So if you are still saying AI is just augmenting individuals inside the company or automating them, you're assuming that the work is organized around individuals the way it used to be. You have to rethink how work has to be organized now that AI comes, and how will it be redistributed? How will it be restructured? It goes back to, the Adobe versus Figma example. In the case of Adobe, the work was organized around the file. So you had to make changes to a file, and only then you could send it to somebody else. So even if you use the cloud, you had to make changes at the level of a file. Figma, you could make changes at the level of an element in the file, because on the cloud, each element could be managed individually, which allowed design to be managed centrally across all these different files. So with AI, unless you see that level of transformation in the nature of work and workflows, you cannot be AI native.
That 100% resonates. I really like this component in the question and the answer.
Mhm.
And then it leads me to thinking, this is also, and I'm sure other people are thinking that, be it a small organization, a middle-sized or large-sized organization. If we take the complex example of a multinational sort of global player, who needs to be involved in that conversation to say, this is our new identity? And we've thought about everything that you've said, because that is complex.
Yeah, today, whether you think about it in terms of AI or not, we are in the midst of so many structural shifts to industries, whether it's tariffs suddenly coming in, or regulation changing, or new technologies coming in, not just AI, but material science, synthetic biology, etc. All of these factors change the structure of how value can be created, and it changes the structure of how you think about decisions like what should we build, what should we buy, where can we trust external vendors versus what do we need to build internally. These discussions are very strategic, so you need to have obviously the CEO, the capital allocator in the room. You need to have the experts within the company to advise the CEO, but fundamentally it's a strategy and capital allocation decision. It's not a technology decision. The cloud took like 5 years to move away from the CIO and head of IT to becoming a CEO related discussion. And I think that needs to happen much faster with AI.
Wonderful. It's been a really enriching conversation, Sangeet, and I'm sure that every single person that's listening to it is going to take something different from it. So I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise.
It resonates a lot with what I've experienced in the last year. And
Yep.
yeah, it's definitely exciting, but a lot of correction and sort of alignment needs to happen. I'm actually thinking as well, I think like the whole narrative is also extremely useful for sales individuals, because it is a different sell. It's about understanding how
Absolutely.
it will fit into workflows. And I think that I completely agree with you. I think that mental shift needs to happen both in how it's being sold. Mm-hmm. That's mainly what I'm hit from that angle. Right. But also how it's absorbed and interpreted by the organization. So I thank you for being on Redefining AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Such a pleasure.